The street looked like any other slice of the American dream. Neat lawns clipped perfection, porches wrapped in white railings, neighbors who smiled politely while keeping their distance. But for David Brooks, a broad-shouldered black man in his early 40s who had traded years of combat deployments for the promise of quiet, this cul-de-sac would soon prove more hostile than the battlefields he thought he'd left behind, because behind its trimmed hedges and neighborhood cookout sat an HOA, board that believed power wasn't about community but about control, and they enforced that belief through two men who treated the title HOA Enforcement Division like a badge of honor. Mark and Jeff, enforcers in tan vests with radios strapped to their shoulders, mirrored sunglasses covering eyes too quick to sneer, men who strutted from door to door as though their clipboards carried the weight of law. At first, David brushed off their harassment. Bogus fines about his truck, letters claiming his porch light wasn't the correct wattage, threats over his kid's basketball hoop. Because after years as a Navy SEAL chief, he understood that patience was sometimes the sharpest weapon, that the calm silence of waiting unnerved bullies more than shouting ever could. But the harassment escalated. Mark and Jeff circled his property at night with flashlights, left fake eviction warnings taped to his door, muttered, "Time's almost up," when they passed him on the sidewalk. Still, David stayed steady, arms folded, binder thick with every notice he logged, every false claim copied and filed. And then came the morning that stripped away the last pretense of subtlety. David was standing on his own porch in a plain gray T-shirt and jeans, coffee cooling on the railing beside him, when the enforcers marched up with papers in hand, tactical vests strapped tight, voices pitched to carry down the street. "You need to move out now," Jeff barked, thrusting the so-called eviction notice toward him, while Mark stood behind with a hand resting far too casually on his holstered sidearm. Neighbors peeked through curtains, children pressed against screen doors, all waiting to see if this quiet man would finally break. But David didn't flinch. He didn't reach for the paper. He didn't even raise his voice. He just crossed his arms, eyes steady, jaw locked, and said with the calm finality of a man who had led brothers through firefights on foreign soil, "Wrong man, wrong porch." The words hung in the air heavier than any shout, and though the enforcers laughed for show, the flicker in their eyes betrayed the first ripple of doubt, because deep down they sensed what no one else on that street yet knew, that the man they thought they could bully into silence was the same man who once commanded warriors trained to end fights before they even began, and that behind his quiet calm was a phone call away from 6 SEALs who still had his back. The weeks after that porch confrontation unfolded like a slow, grinding siege, the kind designed not to break walls but to wear down nerves, to make a man question his peace in his own home, and the enforcers of the so-called HOA Enforcement Division knew exactly what they were doing, or thought they did, because Mark and Jeff doubled their efforts, showing up at odd hours with clipboards and smug expressions, circling David's property like hyenas circling prey, taking photos of his truck from every angle, measuring his lawn with tape as if grass could become a crime, knocking on his door with false compliance checks that he never opened, only watching them through the window with the stillness of a man who had survived much worse than suburban bullies in vests. The harassment came in waves. Bogus violation slips shoved under his mat about structural noncompliance because of a flower bed his wife had planted, fines for improper porch lighting, even though the bulb was the exact model listed in the guidelines, a citation for unapproved basketball equipment after his son shot hoops in the driveway. Neighbors noticed, but most kept their heads down, some whispering sympathy over mailboxes, others nodding along with the HOA out of fear that they'd be next if they spoke up. The board president, Cynthia Kane, only fueled harassment, her emails layered with bureaucratic poison, calling David a disruptive resident, warning that failure to comply will result in escalation, and always signing off with her polished name like a signature made her threats legitimate. But David didn't bend, didn't snap. He collected everything, logging dates, times, photos, and signatures into a binder so thick it could have doubled as armor, knowing that every page was ammunition for the day the HOA finally overplayed their hand. That day drew closer with every encounter. Jeff ambushing his wife in the driveway, asking if she was prepared for relocation. Mark cornering his teenage son at the park, warning that this won't end well if your dad keeps resisting. Even Cynthia, standing smugly at a community meeting, declaring, "Some residents think they're above the rules, but nobody is above enforcement." Her eyes locking on David, like a gun barrel across the room. The harassment wasn't just paperwork anymore. It was psychological warfare, the kind David knew well. Except these opponents weren't trained soldiers. They were pretenders, and pretenders always made one fatal mistake. They confused patience for surrender. David's family began to feel the weight. His wife asking late at night if they should move before it got worse. His son flinching when he saw the HOA truck creeping past again. His daughter whispering that she didn't feel safe walking home from school. Still, David's calm never wavered. He hugged them tighter, reassured them with words that carried the steel of truth. We don't run from bullies. We stand. And when the time comes, they'll see exactly who they tried to push. And then the time came. Cynthia signed an official-looking notice stamped final eviction order and sent Mark and Jeff to deliver like executioners, stopping up his porch with vests strapped, radios hissing, voices pitched in the neighborhood as they shoved the paper at his chest and barked, "You need to move out now." Neighbors spilled into yards, filming with their phones, whispers rising like smoke. Can they do that? Is that even legal? Why are they targeting him? But the enforcers didn't care about legality, only spectacle, wanting the block to see their power. David didn't flinch, didn't even unfold his arms. He looked at them with the same measured calm he'd used in war zones when enemies thought they had the upper hand. And then, without a word, he reached into his pocket, pulled out his phone, and pressed one number on speed dial. Mark sneered. "Who you calling, your lawyer?" "Won't matter." Jeff laughed. "Better start packing." But David only said 6 quiet words. "It's time. I need you here." 15 minutes later, the rumble of black SUVs echoed down the street, engines low, doors opening to reveal 6 men in plain clothes, but carrying themselves with the unmistakable weight of warriors. His SEAL brothers, men who had once cleared compounds with him in the dead of night, men who had bled beside him and would never let him stand alone. They fanned out silently, disciplined, no theatrics, their presence heavier than weapons, and suddenly the balance shifted. The enforcers who had strutted for months now looked small, caught in the gaze of men who knew real authority, real power, real brotherhood. One of the SEALs stepped forward, eyes like steel, voice low but deadly certain. "You got about 3 seconds to step off this porch before you learn the difference between pretending to have power and standing in front of men who actually do." And for the first time, Mark and Jeff faltered, sweat beading under their sunglasses, the papers in their hands trembling, because deep down they knew the game was over. The street had seen its share of petty HOA patrols and clipboard theatrics, but nothing like the sight of 6 men stepping out of those black SUVs. Men who didn't need badges or vests to announce authority. Men whose steady eyes and quiet formation told the truth louder than any shouting could. They weren't here to fight. They were here to stand, and their presence alone rewrote the script. Neighbors froze on porches, phones trembling in their hands, children peeking from behind screen doors as David's SEAL brothers took their places. 2 flanking the walkway, 2 watching perimeter, one standing slightly behind David like a silent wall of assurance. Mark and Jeff, who had strutted onto the porch minutes earlier full of false bravado, now looked like actors caught in the wrong play, their tactical vests suddenly ridiculous against the calm, lethal competence facing them. Jeff's voice cracked first. This is private HOA business. You can't interfere." One of the SEALs, Torres, a mountain of a man with eyes that looked carved from stone, tilted his head and answered with a voice so low it barely carried, but everyone heard it. "What you're doing isn't enforcement. It's harassment. And right now it looks a lot like impersonating law." His words weren't shouted. They didn't need to be. Authority, real authority, lived in the quiet certainty of men who had enforced it in places where mistakes meant coffins. Mark tried to recover, pointing to the paper in his hand. "We have an eviction order. This resident is non-compliant." David finally unfolded his arms, stepped forward, and let his voice cut through the humid air. "That paper is worthless. You have no legal authority, no jurisdiction, no backing. You're thugs in borrowed uniforms, and this is where it ends." The words landed like blows, and the neighbors, who had been watching in silence for months, began murmuring, a ripple of realization spreading. If this man who had endured so much could stand this tall, then maybe they had been wrong to stay quiet. Jeff opened his mouth again, but another SEAL, Ramirez, stepped forward with slow, deliberate calm. pulling out his phone. "Every second of this is recorded," he said. "Your threats, your false papers, your intimidation. Keep talking. You're building the case for us." The enforcers exchanged a panicked glance, sweat beading at their temples. But Cynthia Kane, the president, who had been standing at the end of the driveway with arms crossed, shouted across the yard, "Don't back down. Do your job." Her voice wavered, less queenly now, more desperate. And for the first time, the neighborhood heard what she really was, not a leader, but a bully hiding behind muscle. David turned toward her, his gaze unshaken. "Your job is over, Cynthia. You've harassed families, intimidated children, and sent these clowns to my porch thinking fear would do what fairness couldn't. Not anymore." The words felt final like a gavel, and the silence that followed was broken only by the click of cameras from neighbors who wanted this recorded not just for proof, but for history. And then, with the inevitability of a storm breaking, the situation flipped entirely. One of the SEALs, Daniels, stepped up to Mark and Jeff, his movement precise, almost gentle, but his eyes locked with the predator's patience. "Listen carefully," he said, his voice calm but carrying across the entire street. "You are on the porch of a retired SEAL chief. That means you're standing in front of a man who has done more for this country than you can comprehend. You come here in fake uniforms, trying to scare him out of his home, and you think there won't be consequences." Jeff stammered. We were just following board orders," but Daniels leaned closer, his whisper sharp enough to cut. "That excuse doesn't work in court, and it doesn't work here." He stepped back, gestured to David's thick binder on the table beside him. "The months of log harassment, every fine, every false citation. We have evidence. We have witnesses. You're done." The neighbors gasped as one by one. The SEALs pulled out their phones, recording, photographing, documenting, turning the entire spectacle back on the bullies who had built it. The balance of power shifted so completely that even Cynthia faltered, her face pale, her lips fumbling for orders that no one would follow. David, still calm, walked down the steps of his porch, standing eye to eye with Mark and Jeff, his voice steady. "You wanted to see fear. Instead, you're seeing what it looks like when a man has a team at his back. You try to make this about rules. This is about right. And today, right wins." His brothers didn't cheer, didn't shout, didn't need to. Their silence was a roar of discipline, the sound of men who had fought real battles and knew this was already over. The enforcers, once loud, now looked at the ground, their bravado leaking away like air from a punctured tire. Cynthia sputtered one last time. "You will regret this. This whole neighborhood will regret it." But her words fell flat, drowned in the sight of 6 SEALs standing like an unmovable wall behind the man she tried to break. And in that moment, the neighbors, who had been silent for so long, began to step forward, not to fight, but to stand. One by one, they crossed their yards, cameras still rolling, voices rising in support. "We're done with this. No more threats. He's right. We deserve better." The tide had turned, and no amount of paper citations or fake vests could stop it.